person goes to war, their family essentially goes with them. They're incredibly invested in this experience and often traumatized by it. But if we add in family, spouses, boyfriends and girlfriends, parents, children, we're still well under 10%. So more than 90% of this country has not had a personal stake in these wars. That was another motivation for writing the book, that realizing that our fighting class is separate from our citizenry, incredibly separate, geographically, socially, and experientially, even emotionally. There's a reason for that. Those of you who are a little older than me, and I see a few of you in the room, will remember the draft. When we had a draft, our national military policy was essentially hooked up to a mail lottery. Any household in America would have to wonder if someone from their household would be called away to the military services. And whether you had nieces or nephews or grandchildren or children, you had to worry about that. When we did away with selective service and we replaced it with the all-volunteer force, we concentrated military service in a self-selecting set of families, often the same families, generation after generation. If you talk, as I did, to many veterans of these recent wars, roughly half of them, by my estimate, had another family member in the service. It's an incredibly narrow slice. And that's one of the downsides, I think, of doing away with the draft. We praise the all-volunteer force for its efficiency and for the morality of sending people to war who chose to go to war as opposed to randomly selecting citizens and sending them to war. But one result of this is that we have a fighting class that is really separate from this country.
Is our foreign policy different because of that as well?
I would argue it is. I mean, one of the chief effects of having an all-volunteer force is it extinguished almost the anti-war movement, right? I mean, we talk among ourselves sometimes and say, if we had a draft, let's say, just as a thought exercise, a pure provocation, because we're not going to have a draft. Politically, it'll never sell. But imagine if we started a draft tomorrow. Do you think the population would be a little restive? Instantly, it would be. I mean, I know people say, if we had a draft, tomorrow the Pentagon would be levitated over the Potomac and dropped into the water, It would just be completely different. So, yeah, I think that we've lost, by disconnecting the people from war fighting, I think we've lost a lot of the public pressures on our foreign policy and certainly our military policy. That's the downside of this.
So let's go back a little bit before the writing of this book. So you finished your career in the Marine Corps and you decided to go to journalism school. Why?
Well, I knew I wanted to be a writer. I knew I didn't have anything to say. And journalism school, to me, training for newspaper work was kind of like training for the infantry. I figured newspaper writers were writing every day. They probably knew how. The discipline of daily deadlines, I thought might teach me to write. So I had a fairly narrow reason for going in. I should add, I grew up in a house without a television set, so reading and the written word was the way I learned most things, either that or in conversation. I didn't have a lot of visual or screen stimulation my whole life. So I also believed in newspapers as a medium for national and local discourse. What I found after I started newspapering was I enjoyed it unto its own, and I kind of gave up the idea of becoming a writer and was very satisfied with the idea of being a journalist, and there's a difference between the two. It suited my personality very well. It gave me an outlet for a lot of the sort of confrontational side of my personality. I enjoyed that, so I got hooked very quickly on the journalism side of the job, and the writing is just the last step, really, of the journalism.
Do you, when you are reporting in a war zone, how do you go about getting a story there that might be different from your time chasing Buddy Cianci around Providence, for example?
At the basic level, all newspaper stories are the same. I mean, let's demystify and deglamorize this. I mean, a lot of newspapering is walking up to someone saying, how do you spell your name? What's your middle initial? How do I get in touch with you later when I go to write this so I can follow up and make sure I have it right? In other words, what's your cell phone? What's your email address? How do I find you? And then the questions are pretty much always the same. What do you know? What don't you know? How do you know what you know? Who else should I talk to? Right? And then you get to the end and you recap it. When you're dealing with dishonest characters, which is a significant part of the job, you ask them a lot of questions to which you already know the answer as a way of kind of evaluating how much they're on the level with you, or even how much they're just blowing smoke. Because sometimes there are people who think they're on the level with you, but they're passing second, third, fourth-hand information or just shoddy ideas. And you assemble it all. And, that's the same whether it's a rollover on Route 95 or an airstrike in Fallujah. The basics are the foundation of the job, and they don't really change. What does change is, the danger escalates episodically, and the living conditions are different, and, obviously much harsher. But I was lucky. I'm sort of made out of wood, so I'm fine living on the ground or sleeping under a sheet of plywood. It's just a feature of, how I was made. I don't know where I got that from, but I don't mind hot. I don't mind cold. I don't mind wet. So I was fine doing this for years. I also like people, basically, particularly low-ranking people without a lot of authority, people who a lot of others consider in the way. I'm interested in communing with them and listening to them and getting to know them. That helped.
Does that particular affinity for folks who are in the ranks, does that come from your own experience in the service, or is that just part of who you are? Or can we not
I think it comes,
those two?
I mean, you never know. You don't know how you become who you are. The Marine Corps certainly aggravated my allergy to authority, which drove me lower. But I was probably already inclined that way. I don't really know. The other thing about war reporting is it's often, you think of it as really fast, and some things are very, very fast. But a lot of it's really slow. There's a lot of times there's nothing going on. Or you're working through a translator, which slows things down. Things go at about 1/3 speed with a translator, which I find really valuable because then I can really keep up. I also, as I aged, I grew half deaf. That helped. Because I could tell people, I didn't hear you. Can we say that again? And we'd do it again and again. We'd kind of go slowly, This is 45 RPM, not 78. Boy, that dates me. Right? Yeah, everyone under 40 doesn't know what I just said. So I don't know where it came from. But I'm the same way in my own newsroom, I get along better with my peers and my bosses. It's just the way the stripes were painted on me.
So how did your experience though as a veteran, as someone who served in the United States Marine Corps, how did it shape your reporting, particularly in combat situations? How did it sort of shape the stories that you decided to write about? Did it?
So there's a lot of answers to that. Sometimes it was a real asset because I know the weapons, I know the tactics. I could sit in on a patrol order. I just go out and walk on endless patrols with people or drive endless patrols. And when they're organizing and when they're out there actually patrolling, I understood what they were doing. It all kind of floated around me almost in 3 dimensions. I knew the fire support overlay, I knew the route planning, I knew the different frequencies they were on, I understood their language. That made it a lot easier to grasp what was basically going on. But one of the downsides was that there were people who thought, because you were a Marine, you're on board, right? Here's our prevailing narrative, and you agree with it. But often I didn't agree with it. I wanted to see for myself. And so sometimes when I parted with the military's prevailing narrative, people got upset because they thought I was one of them. I'm not one of them. I'm a veteran. I wasn't on active duty. And many of the people on active duty had strong dissent with what was going on tactically at my level that I was covering, and sometimes I was channeling them. So this all clearly informed. The other thing that happened a lot was that when you get bullied out there, when some first sergeant turns on you, because like the photographer you're with just took a picture of someone in a T-shirt who's like out of uniform, you could be like, first sergeant, go fuck yourself. Like just get away from me, man. Like it's different. Like I wasn't really intimidated by the rank because I'd been in, and you knew who was the blowhard, and that helped. Like I think if I had been a civilian, if I hadn't worn the uniform, I would have been intimidated in a lot of situations where, to me, I was able to say to myself, I don't have a rank here, and to me, the PFC, the private first class, he puts his pants on the same way as the general, and to me, is the general's equal. Person's a person, and I could listen to whoever I wanted to, and people couldn't really box me in. Because the military system, I'd been in it, it just didn't really, a lot of the rules didn't really impress me as necessary, and I could just cover the people.
So we mentioned we're in year 17 of the war in Afghanistan. The war in Iraq sort of continues on a low simmer, it seems, and the chasing of ISIS back and forth across the border. Are these wars that the United States was ever going to be able to win?
No. I mean, win's a tough verb, but let's say, are we ever going to really succeed? I play a numbers game to realize how conceptually wrong the military policy in these wars are. So let's do the numbers, all right? How many people, as I wrote them down, I have to write them down to remember them, I've been knocked on the head too many times. How many people live in Iraq? Does anybody know? Okay, about 37 million, according to the recent estimates. And Afghanistan's about 31. All right? So at the peak of the Iraq war, during the so-called surge, we had maybe 160,000 troops on the ground. At the peak of the Afghan war, we had around 100,000. These numbers are a little deflated because they don't count what's in the air. There's always accounting tricks that the Pentagon's doing. So they'll station aircraft on carriers that reach the wars and are flying overhead, and none of that is counted. But they give you a good estimate. So, but 150, 160,000 over 37 million, 100,000 over 31 million. Now let's translate those numbers to something that you might be able to relate to. How many people do you think live in Texas? Less than 30 million. About 28 million. Do you think you could take 100 or 150,000 people and go down to Texas and pacify it? Do you? I mean, what were we thinking? Right? New England has 15 million people. That's now Connecticut North. Do you think 100,000 people could put New England in its place with rifles? 15 million. Yeah. You do? Yeah, that's one. You're the first one ever who said that. And I'll you're allowed to think that. I don't. Now imagine, let's go back to Texas because we've got a dissenter. So I didn't hear any disagreement on Texas, which is okay. And actually the numbers are closer with Texas. Now imagine everyone in Texas spoke Arabic, or they spoke a mix of Pashto and Tajik. Now imagine there are two prevailing sects in the country religiously, and they're having their own war, and you're overlaid on top of that. How would that work? You're going to get a bunch of 19 and 20-year-olds who speak only English and put helmets on their head and tell them that they can pacify or prevail under these circumstances? Now you're going to change doctrine every 2 or 3 years. And you're going to tell them now you're going to try counterinsurgency. You're going to nice your way across the country. I mean, this didn't really conceptually make sense. And it's the kind of thing I also think goes back to the draft, right? If we had a draft, I don't think people would be happily sending their children to numbers that stack up like that.
So, I mean, that's stark. What is the moral and ethical consequence of for the men and women that you write about, and being set on what you're describing is really sort of an impossible and yet potentially lethal task.
So this is where I pivot. A lot of my work's not about everything we've talked about so far. These things happen. Policy and strategy for a troop is kind of like weather. It's out of your control. You just live in it. That's what I focus on. So we have people who sign up for whatever their reasons, and there's a lot of reasons, almost entirely in good faith, almost entirely wanting to do the right things. As a society, I think we misapply them. But the troops may not agree, not in their youth. They just try to do what's in front of them, do as they're told. And they come mostly, I won't say universally, but something like universally, to a certain set of conclusions, which is they want to make a good account of themselves. They want to take care of the people on their left and on their right. That's what I saw consistently. For me, that became nearly universal out there. That's what I tried to capture, which is whatever the national projects were, which I just critiqued very harshly and unapologetically. I separate that from the personal experiences of the wars. I can't expect most 18 and 19-year-olds, the people who sign up, to grasp the things we just said. It took me years to arrive at the idea that maybe even I had been duped. It took a while for me to let the Kool-Aid pass through my own system as a former Marine. But whatever you think about the larger critique, the people mattered. The people needed to be understood. And capturing some part of that human experience and relating it to outsiders, like many people in the room, became part of my job. I'm not an optimistic person. I don't have a huge faith in journalism like some people do. I don't think we change that much. I do think, though, we can relate human experiences and maybe influence the conversation a little.
So let's talk about some of the human experiences that you write about in the fighters. Let's talk first about Doc Kirby.
So Doc fit that profile I just described of someone who wanted to show up and serve and really make a difference. Doc was also informed personally by the ambition of being a hero. It's just an idea he had. It's not common, but it's not entirely uncommon either. And so Doc volunteered, as most people do, for the Navy, but then volunteered additionally to try to become a corpsman. A corpsman is the Navy's version of a medic, and the word corps is from Marine Corps, and it means assigned to the Marine Corps. And so Doc was assigned to a Marine infantry battalion and then sent on his second tour. His first tour was relatively uneventful. The second tour, though, was in 2006 in one of the worst parts of Iraq. And the military is loaded with euphemisms, acronyms and euphemisms. That's what the military is at the conversational level. And the euphemism in 2006 was economy of force. That's a pretty sugar-coated way of saying not enough people to do what we're being asked to do. And he was assigned to the rural outskirts of Fallujah after the big sweep through Fallujah that the Marines had done 2 years before. One of the things the sweep accomplished was driving the militants in Fallujah out into the countryside, where they lived in a network of canals in an agricultural zone that was surprisingly vegetated. For people who think of Iraq as a desert, well, much of it's not. It's thickly irrigated and invested in crops, including perennial crops. I mean, there's great groves of date palm trees and oranges and the like, along with the annual crops like the wheats and the tomatoes and all of that. And so Doc was in this agricultural zone. They did not have anything like enough people to really influence it. They spent a lot of their time just resupplying themselves and trying to patrol along a road or two. And that road was vicious. It was essentially a death gauntlet, a lottery of snipers and bombs. And over the course of his tour there, his roommate was shot through the head. his former roommate. His roommate from the United States was shot through the head. Others were wounded. The snipers kind of were picking away at the company. And on Christmas Day, when he had been in the country about 5 months, Doc was assigned to a rooftop post, and a sniper shot him through the mouth. And he lived. I mean, it was one, and I mean, you could try to replay that shot. If you were really macabre, you could try to replay that shot 1,000 times, and the other 999 times you'd kill Doc. But this passed, you know, through one cheek and out the other, under the nose, above the bottom jaw. And it had a devastating effect on him and almost killed him from blood loss, because you can't put a tourniquet on your head. But a helicopter came, he was put in the helicopter, he was flown to a surgical center, he was stabilized, and he began a journey into the rest of his life. This was this Christmas Day 2006, so it was a dozen years ago approximately. He's had about 30 surgeries since. Initially he couldn't talk, because he lost part of his tongue, part of his jaw. They took bone from his leg and refashioned a jaw and loaded his mouth with titanium. And it gradually, Doc sunk into depression and, I would argue, alcoholism, certainly alcohol abuse, painkiller abuse, hypervigilance, which leads to insomnia, which leads to exhaustion, which makes the whole thing worse. He lost his wife and tried to kill himself by driving his truck off the road at something like 100 or 110 miles an hour. Somehow he lived, and slowly began rebuilding from there. The suicide attempt galvanized his family around him, and his mom remembered that he had met someone at a charity function, a benefit for veterans, who had offered him medical help should he ever need it. And the mother reached out, Doc's mother reached out to this gentleman, who then connected him to a few doctors, and they rebuilt his face pro bono about 2 years ago, and gave him new dental implants. This was outside the VA system. This was at a maxillofacial surgical center in New York. And after that surgery was done, his bottom jaw, for the first time, aligned more closely with his top jaw, with his upper jaw. And when they put in the new dental implants, they weren't, because they were aligned, he could start to eat more solid food. And many months after the surgery, he, for the first time, bit into an apple. First time in like 10 years. And Doc has since, he's with another woman now who came with 2 kids. They have this wonderful blended family. He's added 2 more kids to the pile. And he went from being catastrophically lonely and struggling through every day to having, at the moment, and I hope it continues, a very rich life. He's working again, too. He's on a pipeline job in Oklahoma.
Dr. Lewis, I'm really enjoying the conversation, but if you could give some instruction on the microphone again, the rest of us would love to hear every word.
Oh, you guys didn't hear me?
No, we cannot.
Oh.
No.
So if you sort of,
I got to hold it like this? All right. Thank you.
Yeah, it's the microphone, it's not you. They have
Yeah.
to hear the microphone.
Yeah, and I'm like Mr. Magoo. I can't hear very well, so I never know if I'm loud enough. Yeah.
so let me ask you a question, because I know earlier in Doc Kirby's story, you mentioned his roommate is shot through the head in Iraq, and Doc has some questions about.
So that was the moment. That was the moment when his roommate Colin was shot through the head. That was the moment where Doc came to realize his ambition of being a hero. He saved Colin's life, and then he wondered right afterward if he'd done the right thing, because chunks of Colin's brain were missing. A bullet passed through his head, and he wondered what kind of future he was delivering Colin to. And this weighed on him. I don't remember exactly how long, but a week or 2, he almost didn't sleep. He went into like a zombie-like state where he was volunteering for duty so as not to sleep and doubting what he had done. And then one day he was hit, the vehicle he was traveling in was hit by a bomb, and he was wounded, had a concussion. So they took him off the front line, put him down at Camp Fallujah and under observation, under the concussion protocols that were beginning to make their way through the ranks at that time. There was like a policy of observation and waiting to see how people fared after they had a traumatic brain injury. And so Doc was on a base that had phone service, hanging around the medical center, and because he was basically a medic, he was a known entity there, so he had some access. And one of the other medics told him one day, "Hey, there's a phone call for you." And he was like, "What? Like a phone call for me in Iraq?" And he got on the phone, and it was Colin's father thanking him for saving his life. And that really helped Doc. It really kind of reordered Doc's thinking, or lifted this intense moral confusion that he was suffering from during those. I'm going to say it was about 2 weeks, but I don't remember exactly. I always have to consult my notes.
How did you find Doc and learn his story in the first place?
I was with him on the day Colin got shot. I was in the truck with him. I was just doing I would do these long-term embeds. I would just go and stay. And so I was living with Doc's unit, and there was a raid that day, and I went on the raid with them. And at the end of the raid, when they were done, they were walking back to their trucks, and we walked right by Colin. He was up in the turret of one of the vehicles on what they call overwatch, which is just what it sounds like, looking over the area. And there was one single shot.
So I'm going to come around. If you've got questions, raise your hand. I'll come to you. Before I do that, I want to ask you one other question. You and I have talked previously about sort of your book in the sort of the history of war literature. And you and I have talked about things like With the Old Breed or Helmet for My Pillow. Where do you see your work and other works that have come out of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan against that larger body of accounting of Americans at war?
So I'm going to dodge talking about my work. If anyone here cares to read it, you can reach your own conclusions about it. I'd rather not talk about my own. I will say this: it's early. The best stuff hasn't been written yet. It takes time. So before the conversation, we checked a few dates. So does everyone know With the Old Breed? It's one of the seminal books of the World War II experience, written by Eugene Sledge. And the Marine Corps actually teaches the book. They have everyone read it, which astonishes me, because if you do read it, it's one description after another of war crimes. In plain English, it really is. Alongside with these people in this unbelievable grinder who were trying their best to take care of each other. But it's a shocking book, and it's one that's lasted. You know when it came out? I have to look. 1981. Yeah, almost 40 years later. Yeah. It covers Peleliu and Okinawa. Those were the two battles that Sledge participated in as a Marine mortarman. So let's jump forward a few wars. Vietnam. The things they carried is considered sort of as similarly like a reference of the soldiers' experience of that war. You know when the things they carried came out? 1990. 15 years after the fall of Saigon, and more than 20 after the author served in the infantry. My favorite novel from Vietnam is Matterhorn by Karl Marlantes, and it covers mostly an infantry platoon, but an infantry company focusing most on a platoon in what is essentially the hill fights in hill around the Hill 880. It's a fictional account, but you can clearly see that this is the run up to Khe Sanh, and it's a dark book. They can't get anything right. The thing they get right, which is building a set of bunkers, they then leave, and the Vietnamese occupy the bunkers, and they have to attack their own bunkers at the end of the book, and they suffer terribly doing that. Their colonel's a drunk and something of a careerist, although I've seen worse. When they go to, near the end of the book, when some of the troops want to frag someone they're angry at, they frag the wrong guy. They even get that wrong. I mean, it's a dark, ugly, gloomy, heavy book. 2008. 2008, 33 years after. So what are we? I mean, we're in the infancy phase of the literature from our wars. So I have no idea how this will stand up. That's all up to you. I don't have 33 years to wait. So I wrote when I could. But I think I haven't read the best stuff yet. I'm sure I haven't. I mean, history tells me I'd be a fool to think otherwise.
Your questions. Raise your hand and I'll come to you.
You had a question at the first remark.
It's the same question.
Go ahead.
It's a two-part question. What's your impression of you talk about the fighting class. What's your impression of the sort of social demographics of the fighting class? And how does that drive the motivation for them to become fighters?
So where do they come from is basically what you're asking. I already tipped my hand on that. I think a very large fraction, arguably the most significant fraction, but I don't have the data, so don't hold me to that, comes from families who've served before, right? The families that have been to war will keep going to war. The families that do careers will give more children to the rank and file. That's the largest one. So geography, race, and income. I would like to have the statistics in front of me to answer that. I can tell you so I have to speak mostly to the fighting units. The infantry is where I spent most of my time, and some of the helicopter units. And I did spend a little bit of time with the strike fighter pilots. The strike fighter pilots are almost all white male. The infantry units are, when I was there, all male. Entirely male. The desegregation along gender lines has only just begun in the last few years, and it's not microscopic, but it's very small. I think in the Marine Corps there's been 60 or 40, I don't remember. I knew the numbers a few weeks ago. So far, women who've made it through the training are in the units. Once you get past the gender cut, and this also aligns with my own experience when I was in, I've never seen as diverse a population in any other institutions in this country. That's not to say everyone gets along. They manage. And I used to think we get along better than we did. I used to think when I was in that this was sort of a great social experiment where people from different backgrounds and ethnicity and races could have a sense of common purpose and work together. And largely it works that way, and largely it succeeds, but there always was like a lot of ribbing along racial and ethnic lines. And now Facebook, you guys know what Facebook is? Do you hear the joke about Facebook? Facebook invented an app that tells you who your racist friends are. It's called Facebook. A lot of these people, they get out of the military and they start acting out on Facebook, and you realize those things they were saying that seemed kind of gentle and like remarks that might sort of thaw the boundaries were actually the remarks of racists who just kind of like only had it masked a little bit. Like I misjudged that as a younger man. So this is in some ways our national melting pot, but I'm not going to sit here and sugarcoat and say it's all great, because I don't think it is. I think it manages to succeed, but it's troubled.
Thank you. What I'm addressing today is the 100th anniversary of the signing of the armistice. 2018, 100 years ago, people were interested and excited about the end of a horrible, horrible war, World War I. And now the British poets of World War I are being remembered. Their library of literature is beautiful and horrible. And we're honoring it in Middletown Library by having a poetry reading on the Sunday before, November 11th, the 11th hour, the 11th day, and the 11th month. And we're all looking forward to bringing an emphasis of peace, because that was a war, you can't say more horrible than any, because they're all horrible. But why do we keep on making war?
Why do we keep on making war? I mean, it's hardwired into us. That's what I'm a skeptic. I'm always the pessimist in the room. You know, I mean, why do we, the United States, keep making war? It's part that we're an island nation. We're incredibly separated from the wars we fight. We've made it easier to wage war with the all-volunteer force by removing some of the checks and balances in society. I mean, does anyone really think Jim Mattis would be popular if we had a draft? Do you think it would be enough for him to speak like Chuck Norris into the microphone and get a lot of Facebook memes? Or do you think he might have to change his tune? We might have to have a strategy. Maybe we have a strategy, but who here in the room can articulate it? No, but we don't have to be united to wage war.
Good evening. I have two questions. One, with the service members training on media and what they're authorized to talk about, how were you able to embed and get the service members to open up to get a more realistic view? And second, your book is called Fighters, and just, that leads to the male service members. But you did talk about in your book, you have female service members, and how did you come across them, since you were embedded mostly with the infantry, and how do you think Afghanistan and Iraq has contributed with females?
Can you break I've been banged on the head a few times. Can you do your questions one at a time?
Okay. So the first one is, how were you able to get the soldiers to talk to you?
Okay, so let's stop. I remember it now. Thank you. So it's actually easier to talk with troops overseas in the United States. It's pretty locked. I just went and talked with someone the other day in Colorado Springs, a remarkable soldier who came over the border at age 6 from Mexico illegally, and then got a green card, joined the Army in his early 20s, and received his citizenship in Afghanistan. Was flown out of the Korengal outpost to the big base at Bagram for a citizenship ceremony in 2009 that was pretty thickly attended by green card holders who were in the ranks from all around Afghanistan who got their citizenship there. So I wanted to interview him. He's now a staff sergeant, and he's in Colorado Springs in the infantry division there. And he wanted me to interview him. So we agreed to do this, and he had to notify his boss or his chain of command that I was in town for other reasons, but I was going to interview him while there. And they sent a major who sat right next to us. I mean, in fairness to this major, he was a pretty good guy, and he was actually kind of apologetic about it, and I think he was kind of glad to get out of a staff meeting and sort of fit his afternoon. But what? I mean, we need to have a major in every conversation. Overseas, that doesn't happen. Like when I would go out, you fill out an application to embed, and you basically say you're insured, and that, there's like a hold harmless agreement, and they review your work to see that you're actually going to publish something, that you have a record of publishing. They don't want to take you around and just because you want to go around. They want to take you around because you're going to write something, and you go through that process. There's a vetting, and then you get past the vetting, and then you show up in Afghanistan or Iraq. And they might give you a little ID card or something. I can't remember. It's been a long time. It changed. It was always changing every 6 months. And then you go out to your unit, and sometimes you meet the colonel or the intelligence and operations officer, and you go down to the company level and you meet the captain, and then you go down past the captain, and you're with a platoon, and pretty soon you're with a bunch of sergeants and specialists and corporals and lance corporals and PFCs. And guess who's not there? The major or the spokesperson. And then you lay down on the ground and go to sleep with them and spend some weeks, and they start to talk to you. It's very easy. And then the other thing that happens, remember I said every story's the same? How do you spell your name? Remember I asked you, how do you spell your name? What's your cell phone? What's your email address? A lot of my conversations, even if the major's there, happen later. If the source is willing, if the source likes your vibe and is willing to talk to you later, you take it offline. And it's not that hard, because you're talking about, right? We said there's almost 3 million people went to the wars. A lot of them didn't want anything to do with me. I don't want to overstate my charm. I don't have any. But some did. There were always enough. So if you go out with a platoon, you end up kind of like befriending a chunk of the platoon. And after you could spend a month with a platoon, there'd still be a few guys you've never spoken to because they won't get near you. And I was that guy when I was in the military, so I understood it. But there are people who come around, and some of these become lifetime connections and friendships. So it wasn't that hard. Now, what was your second question?
The toll the wars have taken on female service members, from what your observations were.
Female service members suffered just like male service members. We're all human. They suffer additionally under the culture of misogyny that is part and parcel in some of the units, in some of the services. You asked me as well, I remember now, how did I find some of the women? When I was assigned to helicopter units, there were incredible women. Like, I'd go out with the infantry even for a few weeks and you wouldn't see a woman. But when I was flying with the Black Hawk medevac units, there were female pilots and female medics. And between flights, like, you kind of live next to the helicopter, often in a little tent right nearby, and wait for a call, and then you hop in and go. I got to know some of them pretty well. And so when the book came along, it was time to write the book. The main characters were male because that's who I knew, but there are a number of female pilots and medics weaved through those sections of the book.
I know I got 3 questions at least left, but if you got one, raise your hand and I'll come to you.
That's on. I just have a quick statement and then a question. Professor Ludes was asking before kind of where he thought your book fit in the previous literature about wars, and I had the chance to actually email this to you directly personally, and I'll say it here for those of you who haven't read the book. I teach classes on the Vietnam War at my university, and I always try and assign something on the recent conflicts at the end of the class so that the students can reflect a bit upon lessons they think should be drawn from the Vietnam War to understand more recent conflicts. And I've struggled to find things to assign. And I wasn't more than 20 or 30 pages into your book when I knew I needed to reopen my syllabus, call the university bookstore, and order it. So my students will be reading your book at the end of the semester, and it's in many ways very comparable to Philip Caputo's book, A Rumor of War, as well as Michael Hurst's Dispatches and some of the other great ones from Vietnam. My question, though, is this. You mentioned Karl Marlantes' novel Matterhorn, which is a great book, and then he wrote another book after that called What Is It Like to Go to War? And in it, he says that in part because military soldiers and military families have become so isolated from the larger society, that we need to find ways to reintegrate people into community, to bring them back into community, and to honor what they've seen and their stories. He draws on ancient cultures and all sorts of other places to think about ways to do that, not just to help veterans with PTSD, but moral injury and so forth. And I'm curious, from your own military experience as well as what you've seen with a lot of the young men and women you report on in the book, you know, they come home with some not just physical injuries and not just psychological injuries, but moral injuries as well. And what you think we can do, what are some things we can do in service, after service, to try and bridge those gaps in some ways?
So by now you've figured out I don't have a lot of faith in our military policy, right? I don't have a lot of faith in our national politics. I do have a lot of faith in communities, local communities. I live in Wakefield. It's an incredible village. Really is. Many of you, I mean, probably most of you are Rhode Islanders, and you live in similar towns. when you're in the military, whether you come home wounded physically, whether you're carrying a moral injury, the freight of doubt and regret about things you may have participated in or not stopped or even witnessed, whether you're suffering from PTSD, which is a hyper form of anxiety that is exhausting. Hypervigilance will run you down and make you antisocial. One thing, no matter what you're carrying, even if you're carrying all three of those, one thing most people in the military miss when they come home is the sense of community, the intimacy of the squad, the platoon. It's gone, and many people, this was the most intense social circle of their lives. For some people, more intense than their families even. What I think, you asked what can we do, the way we bring people home is we help them replace, or we can't replace the community, we help satisfy their need for community by opening up to them. And there's many ways to do this. It happens in churches, it happens in gyms, it happens in any number of other scenes, preferably not a bar. Bars are really bad for vets, in my point of view, in my opinion. It can happen in families. I have found the people who I have seen come home and do well and thrive, they often have something in common. And it's the word after this very bleak talk is going to surprise you. You know what it is? Love. It's love. They have a spouse or a significant other, or they have children, or they have parents, or they have a group of people who take them fishing who love them. And that satisfies this sense of community that you're often missing. People ache for platoons. Even people who are in, some military units are pretty sharp, and there's others that are just disaster. You can go from one Marine company to another in the same battalion, and one people are getting along pretty well, and the other is it's like a disjointed, it's like a bad family. There's all these cliques and rivalries in it, and it can be ugly. But people who even leave the bad units often miss them. It's incredible how you get socialized to other people, and then how empty you feel when you get out. So my message on this is always integration, integration. And that comes from people opening up. I was lucky. I spent years at war. I came home, and I live in a great town, and people are really open to me. And that kind of has helped me sort of settle myself down, too. Did I answer your question?
Hi, Skipper. How you doing? I was drafted in 1970, and fortunately I was allowed to go in the Marines. And the guys that I worked with, when I became an officer later on, they were so easy. The all-volunteer force was so easy. The guys that the men and women that I took into the Gulf War were 180 out from what I went into. It was so horrible when I went in. Leadership could not control us. It was unbelievable. And now I see these guys. My son's a Marine. And I see these guys that are, these young men and women are so terrific. Yeah. I just can't believe that we're able to pull these type of people out of this country with all of the, the superficial things that we go by. And to see these guys perform, it's amazing to me. How do you feel these guys got into this, that they were able to perform like that?
I'm going to stop you because I max out. My brain only holds, it's like a couple of kilobytes, and it just tilts. First, I'm going to cut up what I can remember what you said into pieces. I agree with your assessment, and I have to say, sir, you're like a type. Like what you just said to me, I heard when I joined. I signed up 1983. There was the attack on the barracks in Beirut. 241 Marines and sailors were killed. I was a freshman in college. I'd considered enlisting a few months before that, but decided to go to college. That attack changed my life. I decided to join the Marine Corps, and I went down to the recruiting station, and in 1985, I went through my first training. 1985, 10 years after the end of the draft, So many of the people who trained me, and then many of the people I served with a few years later in my first infantry unit, had been drafted. And they all sounded like you. They would say, man, you are so lucky that you're here now, for two reasons. One, when we had the draft, there was 6 or 8 people in every platoon who you just could not work with. They did not want to be here. Two, we're not all stoned anymore because we have urinalysis. So between the draft and the drug use, what was going on in the 70s, what you just described, I've been hearing that my whole life. And that was part of the Kool-Aid I described. I believed it. And then I came to agree with you. And now I'm going to cut up the second thing you said. What do I think of the people now? It is like a national sport to make fun of millennials, right? Whatever they are, young people. If you'd been to any of these wars, you would not say a bad word about the millennials. They showed up and fought these wars. They showed up when they didn't have to and fought these wars. And these wars sucked. The other side was on the offense, not us. After the opening few weeks of each war, it was like go out to an outpost, live in an outpost for a year, walk around in a circle or a triangle around the outpost, try to keep the thing supplied while they put bombs in the dirt and snipe at you. Or ambush you on your resupply runs. For like a whole generation of people, this was their experience, and they showed up and they did their best. And so you'll never hear me knock the millennials. Where do we get them? Well, I've kind of answered that now. This will be the third time. A lot of them come out of families that have served before. I may be wrong that it's half, maybe it's like 38%, but there's a huge fraction of families in this country that are committed to military service, and they keep sending their daughters and sons. Go ahead, yeah.
You said at the very beginning that you were writing about the fighters, not the policy or the policymakers. And I think we make that same distinction now. When I see a military person, especially in uniform, I thank them for their service, and I think it's a really common practice. But that's a change from Vietnam. And I wondered if you had some insight as to what happened between Vietnam and now, that we appreciate the soldiers that do the fighting and don't sort of connect them with why we're at war.
Well, I'm not a sociologist, so I'll probably answer this with less sophistication than most people in the room. But part of that is the guilt of how our Vietnam veterans were treated. Part of that, I think, is like a ritualized social behavior that in some cases is inauthentic. I know a lot of people who don't like to be thanked by their service because it feels a little chintzy, a little easy. There's a lot of people who are grateful for it. It's the other thing, when we're talking about veterans, we should not say that there's one type. It's a wide group with a wide set of opinions and behaviors and beliefs, but there's a significant number of them who don't like that. We're a little put off by it. But I think that in the main, this problem, and I'm only saying I think, so put an asterisk, I put 2 asterisks next to it, you can get a better answer from someone else. But I think a lot of that is a legacy of Vietnam, that people want to be different to the current generation than the generation before.
Chris, were you in Kandahar province in Afghanistan? And secondly, a related question, I think the New York Times Magazine did a very extensive article around 2008 of guys that were serving in Kandahar province.
Kandahar?
Yes.
Yes, I was in Kandahar province a number of times. Is there a particular... Do you guys know where Kandahar is? All right, so Afghanistan has a number of principal cities. Kandahar is one of them. It also, in the outskirts of Kandahar, along a riverbed,
The related...
The Arghandab River is where the Taliban was essentially born, out in the agricultural zone there.
I'll do this microphone better. The second question relates, the New York Times did a major article, I think around 2008, in the Times Magazine.
By Barry Barrack?
I don't remember names, but I remember concepts. And it was an extensive article, and left me with the same feeling I had in Vietnam in 1965, and that was a hopeless place that we'd never win. And there were some officers in there, including, as I recall, one of the officers' father was a 3 or 4-star general. But the frustration at Kandahar and how impossible it was to rein that place in.
So yeah, we're still writing that article 10 years later. Right? I mean, I just wrote that article in August. That's what this book, in some measure, says as well. I don't remember that particular one, but I can think of a couple from about that time period. One was up in Korengal Valley, and then there was another, I think, called Warlordistan by Barry Barrack. But I'll go back and look. But it goes back to what I said about the numbers. So many of the people who fought these wars figured out by then that the numbers weren't going to work. I mean, in 2008, I don't have the chart in front of me, but I'm going to estimate we had about 50,000 troops on the ground in Afghanistan, because the pivot, the climb came later, and Obama took office in 2009. We got the surge. It took some months for the surge to be first conceived of numerically and then executed logistically. So it wasn't really till about 2010 that we peaked. 2008, I think we probably had half of what we had in 2010. I'd say 52,000 troops. It was unbelievably scattered and scattershot.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the extensive use of contractors and the National Guard in these recent wars.
So there's contractors and there's contractors, right? Like small C contractors are many of the people from many nationalities who perform many of the logistical functions, running the dining facilities, managing the fuel depots, doing a lot of what we would call menial tasks and freeing up numbers, because they don't count the contractors, but the Congress will count the number of troops on the ground, which would let that troop number on the ground be more rifles and less logisticians. And I think that's just a feature of how we manage our wars now. And then there's contractors who are armed, and they follow a scale too, up to and including contractors that were written about today in BuzzFeed. I don't know if you saw it. There's a major story today about contractors hired by the United Arab Emirates who are claiming to have run a targeted assassination campaign in Yemen. American contractors, along with some former French legionnaires and others. I have not focused as much on contractors, so I tend to, you'll see I'll speak in a very full-throated way about subjects that I think I have a fluency in. I have not spent a lot of time on the contractor piece. There also, I should add, there were local contractors. We hired a lot of Afghans and Iraqis to provide local services, particularly security and truck logistics, moving goods over the roads between the American bases. The first type of contractor I'm more willing to speak about, those that provided logistics. And I think they're a feature, and they're not going to go away. The second kind is obviously an incredibly hot issue that will be debated endlessly and on the merits of each case. But I mean, if you're like asking about Blackwater and stuff like that, I know people who joined them. I know people who've come home, but it hasn't been I mean, this kind of, I only have so much bandwidth. It takes me a lot to understand the conventional rank and file. I also tell people I don't cover the special forces and the elite troops that much either. I do sometimes. It's impossible not to, but they haven't been the focus of my inquiry, And I mean, I joke about SEALs like every week. Another former SEAL writes a book. They're like the most overrepresented group in our literature. I mean, we have a joke that says, well, we know the SEALs weren't involved in the attack on Syria the following morning because there's not a book out about it yet. Yeah. So I kind of looked for the voiceless, if that makes sense, and the voiceless that I could access within the limits of my own lenses and my own understandings. I feel like the Special Forces community is pretty well spoken for, and I feel like the Pentagon itself, the policymakers and the senior officer leadership are connected to more spokespeople than any set of other people on earth. They don't get their message out well, but no one has more organs of amplification than our senior military class. It's the bottom, the people who are in for 4 to 6 who are unspoken for, and that's what I cover.
One of the things in your book I found upsetting was the Valentine's Day massacre. Did the Marines ever figure out what caused those Hivacs to hit that little hut and kill all those people?
Do you guys know what the gentleman's talking about? So the Valentine's Day massacre happened February 14th, obviously, 2010. That's a local name. That's not like it's known among 1 or 2 units. It's not like widely shared across the service. A Marine unit was in a pretty intense, long-running, like day-long fight with the Taliban, a significant number of Taliban, and they wanted some rockets to try to hit a sniper who had pinned down and sort of stop one of the platoons. And the rockets that were ordered up were called HIMARS, and without getting into the technical aspects, I think they're about the size of a telephone pole, maybe 2/3 the size of a telephone pole, and they got like a 200-pound warhead on them, and they're GPS guided, and they work. I mean, the GPS will guide the missile to hit within a few yards of where it's programmed to hit, and it hit the wrong house. And the question was, do the Marines know who did it? It hit the wrong house, and it killed more than 10 civilians, including a bunch of children. It was devastating for the people who were there. And many of them still carry it with them. It was their first time in combat, second day in combat for this unit. For many of the people, these were the first casualties they had seen. And it was awful. And the answer is, maybe we'll talk a little after, because I have to be careful about what I say public. There's what I know, and there's what I can prove. And sometimes I know things like 99%, but that's not proof. So I don't put them in the book. I basically know what happened there. It was human error. It was not a technical problem. The rockets did not go off course. There's a number of reasons for that human error. Which, are you former military? Then I'll just say that it was the first time that unit had been on that ground, and part of the unit was on one map sheet and the other part was on the other map sheet. I see you know now you're starting to, yeah, you get it. Yeah, we'll talk after. I'm not dodging this. I just have to be careful about, as a journalist, what I say publicly about factual matters. The answer is yes, I think people know what happened. Has it ever been declared by the Marine Corps? No, the Marine Corps wanted this to go away, and it went away. It didn't go away in the memories of the people who were there. And it didn't go away in the memories of the layers of the command that were involved in the decision to put the rockets there, because these rockets, so you know, a rocket that's like a telephone pole, they fly up into civilian airspace, so there's airspace clearances that are required to use these rockets. So these aren't like ordered by the corporal and approved by the sergeant. Like, this goes way up. And I have followed it way up and then followed it back down, and I have some things I can tell you in a separate conversation that I'd rather not say into the microphone, because journalism matters, and I don't want to say something that I don't have 100%. Yeah.
Okay. Hi. I was in the military for most of my adult life, and one of the things, I totally agree with you that without a draft or a requirement that all people serve in the military or in some means of federal service, without that, people don't care in this country. They don't. They watch a quip on the TV. War does not affect their vote. But I take it another step. It not only hurts the people in our country, the young people in our country, but it's a moral issue. If every citizen of this country isn't invested in the war by either the chance their child or their husband or their father go to war, or their mother, if they're not invested, they don't care. And so the morality of us attacking other countries, of us engaging other countries in a war, of our getting our way with another country with war, it's an immoral act unless you have the hearts and the minds of the people of the country. And without a draft or public service, you don't get that.
Can I cut up what you said a little bit?
Yeah.
And then I'm going to respond with someone else's answer. So I don't want to take credit for this, what I'm going to tell you, but I'll tell you who or where I got the idea. First of all, when I say draft, I should define my terms. I don't think we need national military service. I don't think everyone at the age of 18 should go down to basic training or boot camp and enter into a period of military service of 2 to 4 years. I don't think that. I think that's ridiculous. I think it would be very counterproductive. Remember that even when we had a draft, we always had volunteers. I mean, we always had, you know, mechanisms for what we now think of as traditional recruiting. Someone wants to join the military, they go down, they take a physical, or like in my father-in-law's case, they get someone else to take the physical for him, in, you know, South Boston. And, you know, and then they go do their years and they get out. People like my father-in-law wanted to go in, they were going to get in, even if they had to pay their buddy to go, you know, step on the scale. I think whatever the size of the military that the country decides we should have, we should draft to fill it. You know, let's just a number out of the air, 1.5 million people, something like that. You know, we've peaked over 2 million, we've been less than 2 million, just a number out of the air, 1.5 million people. Half of those people may show up without a draft. So you draft the balance, whatever it is. And I'm using theoretical numbers here. Now, here's the idea I'm going to share with you about, as you agreed with me basically, we don't have national engagement in the national military policy because we don't have people who have to pay attention to it because they may have to serve in it. So he was a platoon leader whose platoon I had been in the Pesh Valley in Afghanistan. He's now out. And he contacted me a few weeks ago and brought 2 other vets, one who I'd been with in Ghazni province a few years before, and another one who I hadn't met, but who had read me. And so we went to dinner. I think we were in Arlington. We went to dinner a few weeks ago. And this guy had an amazing idea. He said, we should have a draft. Here's the draft. 1,000 people a year, 0 deferments. Just 1,000. He said, that'd be enough to get everyone's attention. 1,000 a year. Again, these are thought exercises. These are provocations. We're not going to do this. I tell people we have as much chance of having a draft as you have growing tomatoes on the dark side of the moon. Like, we're not going to, it's just not going to, it's not going to happen. But think about that if it did. You know, 20 per state. 20 per state. It would change things, change the conversation. But I do want to define my terms. I have never thought, like, I'm not in that camp, you heard this from me already, that thinks our youth are messed up. I'm just not that guy. I'm not going to play that part. That's cheap. I don't think we need to have everyone go to basic training to stiffen the spine of our youth. That's just generational politics. It's nasty. We need a way that our country shows up for our military, but whatever the size of the military is going to be, that's enough. It does not need to be everyone who's 18. You know, no thanks.
I have another comment, and that is, you have said, or at least I hear you saying, military strategy. Do you really mean the national military strategy? Because it's civilians that make up what the military strategy is.
You think so?
Oh, yeah. No question about that.
See, I differ with you on that.
I don't think that it was the military commanders that decided we should go to Afghanistan and Iraq. I think it was the president and primarily the president, not necessarily the Congress, but it wasn't the generals that made those decisions. They served.
Can we stop right there? Because yes and no. I'm going to have you hand the mic. Jim, will you tell me, will you relate what you remember from the occupation period of Iraq when you were on the Hill? How many people you thought we needed based on your assessment and what the generals said?
My
Because the generals
second-
do operationally determine this stuff.
Yeah, my second day on the job, my boss asked me to write a memo about what the Phase 4 force needed to look like in Iraq. And I went back and looked at some Army Historical Institute studies about what the size of the force was in Europe. And I had come back with a number, I think around 560,000 troops, with the expectation that that was probably conservative because Europe had been, the back of resistance in Europe had been broken. I didn't think that was likely in Iraq. And was sort of stunned by those numbers, gave them to my boss, and then the next day, the Department of Defense came up and briefed, 100,000 troops max for Iraq.
So it's a mix. You're right. The big order comes from the politicians, but the military steers it. And like when we were talking about, I think Afghanistan, 2009, early, that's when Obama came in. I remember Obama and McCain both campaigned on Afghanistan thematically sort of being the good war and that we'd lost our way in Iraq and we needed to refocus on Afghanistan, which from where the attacks on New York and Washington had come. So early that year, the national security establishment came up with a bunch of options for the president. They came up with those options. He chose from them, like going to Arby's. Those were their options. Now you could say the president could have driven it, and you're right, he could have, but he didn't. And the reason I shook my head when you said the civilians determine things, there's this great habit of saying you have civilian oversight in all these different aspects of military affairs, and often when I look at who those civilians are, they're like career veterans. They're not that much different than the people they're supervising. That's not like, let's take a straw poll of our citizens and create an actual check and balance on the conversation by having a thick mix of outsiders in it. It's mostly insiders.
Last question.
Yeah, I got to meet Chris for a minute before we started, and I told him I was a fighter in Vietnam and a staff officer in Iraq and Afghanistan. But to get back to what you were saying, as I remember things, Creighton Abrams, who took over for Westmoreland in Vietnam, became chief of staff of the Army, and he designed the new Army so you couldn't go to war without the National Guard and the Army Reserve. And that was to get a buy-in from the country because we lost the will of the people during Vietnam. And that's the way the Army was supposedly designed. And just a comment about, somebody asked about the National Guard and the Reserve.
Yeah, I missed that one. I'm glad you did this.
Yeah.
Tie your questions back
At
together.
one point, I think during the surge, half the troops in Iraq were National Guard. And just a lot of people might know this, but the Rhode Island National Guard, which I was in for 21 years, was the second most deployed per capita state in the country. And it's mainly because we had mostly combat units. But to get back to what I was going to say before all this, I got out of the Army in 1970 and then joined the National Guard in 1985. That's another whole story. But a few years after I got back from Vietnam, I read Bernard Fall's Street Without Joy about the French Indochina War. And this is a few years after I got back, and I'm reading the book, and I'm going, wait a minute. The French did this with APCs. It didn't work. We did it with helicopters. It didn't work. They tried strategic ammo. It didn't work. We tried. I said, didn't anybody read this guy's book? So fast forward to 1998, 99, I'm attending the Army War College at Carlisle. And one of the last things we had to do was fight this mythical battle in North Africa against the INAR, and their capital was Tripoli. Well, of course, it was really Iraq and Baghdad we were talking about. So I come up with my brilliant strategy, and I write that we attack and occupy the enemy capital of Tripoli. My instructor writes back in letters about 2 inches high, stay out of Tripoli. How do you occupy a city of 5 million people who don't want you there? And then this is before 9/11. So you saw what we did, and I'm thinking, maybe these guys should have gone to war college too, because nobody seems to have learned anything from history.
So there's not really a question there. No. Yeah. No, No, I mean, I say a lot that we're very resistant to learning. And to follow up what you said, yeah, people are disconnected. I mean, the opening quote in the book is something like, you know, the United States is not at war. The Marine Corps is at war. The United States is at the mall. And that was written on the door of the Ramadi Government Center in 2007. A friend of mine made a photograph of it, and I used it to open the book. And then I'll get back to what you said, sir. Yeah, and you covered it for me. We could not have fought the wars without the Guard and the reserves. And they filled a number of incredibly difficult jobs, including some of the training missions of the Afghan and Iraqi forces, a lot of the convoy duty, and a lot of this really hard work called route clearance, which is just what it sounds like, but imagine the route's full of bombs. We used a lot of National Guard units to do that. And if you removed that piece, you know, within a few years, the forces were exhausted. And the equipment was breaking and changing. If you look at our military now, it does not look like the military of 2001 or 2003. The vehicles changed, the armor changed. It seemed like every time I go away, I'd come back a couple months later, there was a different door on the trucks, and you had to figure out how to get in and out, how to combat lock them, which matters under fire. Like if you fumble with the door, it's not like just being in a Honda Civic. There's very different doors, and they were changing constantly. The helmets changed, the uniforms changed. At one point, we had our infantry in flight suits, because flight suits were made of Nomex, and Nomex is not a fuel, whereas the clothes you guys are in is a fuel. You know, it would contribute to your burns, and when we got out of Nomex and we got into fire retardant uniforms by like 2007, and then the number of troops going to the burn ward really plummeted. It just constantly changed. The tactics, some of the weapons changed, some of them didn't. It changed a lot. But one thing was consistent. After the first pushes, without the National Guard, this couldn't have happened. And particularly, also, I should add, the Air National Guard. There's a lot of like the C-130s and the cargo planes that were moving people and material around into and out of the theater, and then within the countries were Air National Guard units, including from Rhode Island.
So, Chris, you are too modest to say it, so I'm going to do it. This is an exceptional book. It's for sale in the lobby. He's Chris Chivers. Chris, thank you so much for being with us.